Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian, and welcome to another Philosophy and Theory live stream. Today, I would like to make the argument that you should read philosophy. Now, if you're watching this video, you may have already read quite a bit of philosophy, or at least attempted to read it. And what I'd like to do in this short video is give you a quick introduction to where you might begin when it comes to philosophy. I'm going to lay out some of the basic ideas and background things that you might want to know. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience getting into philosophy and studying it on my own. And finally, I'd like to make the argument that studying philosophy can be not only enriching, but perhaps also life-changing. If you're new to this channel, welcome. This is a community-oriented philosophy and theory live stream lecture series that I've been hosting for the past couple of years. Basically, the goal is to create a place where people who are into philosophy and theory or who are getting into it can gather and relish in their enthusiasm for this thing that we love. I've made a video called or titled You Should Read Theory, in which I talk a little bit more about theory, as well as a bookshelf tour where I talk about my collection of theory and philosophy behind me. But this video is going to be dedicated specifically to getting into philosophy. But before I begin, let me briefly invite you to our Patreon learning community, which is a behind-the-scenes area where I post lots more community-oriented features. There's a bonus podcast that I record after every lecture in which I answer your questions live on Discord. You will also receive a live invite to the Discord, where we have a community of like-minded thinkers, I think, very healthy and friendly culture, as well as an on and off reading group. There are edited transcripts for all of my previous lectures, as well as an ongoing ebook introductory series if you're interested in getting into the works of Zizek, Lacan, Hegel, Kant, what have you. You can find all of that and more on www.patreon.com/Julian Philosophy. That's www.patreon.com/Julian Philosophy. Okay, so let's get right in. Before I begin, I want to give you two reading recommendations that can be really helpful if you want to get into philosophy. And the main distinction that you have to understand, which you may know already, is between primary sources and secondary sources. Which to say, a primary source is a text that was written by one of the philosophers, like Kant or Hume, whereas a secondary source usually analyzes that text and maybe even provides you with an introduction or some context. Now, in some cases, you will have a primary source that is annotated, which is to say it combines a primary source with a secondary source, essentially helping you to read. Think about like annotated editions of Shakespeare that can help you along the way. Now, if you're interested into getting into primary sources and secondary sources, and you're a complete beginner, here's what I would recommend. Number one, a secondary source is the Oxford University Press series, Very Short Introductions. I've been collecting these for many years. I actually have close to 200 of them at this point. I usually pick them up secondhand at various bookstores. In fact, it used to be that every day that I got back from university, I would nip into my local Oxfam secondhand bookstore in Islington, North London, and I would see if they had one of these. Usually they'd sell them for a couple of pounds. This one actually says $3.99. And they're wonderful. They're short, accessible introductions for complete beginners, but with a slightly scholarly mindset. In fact, they're all written by specialists in the area of that thinker. And they're so small that you can literally just put them in your back pocket or into your bag. You can read them on the tube or the train. This is not an ad. This is something that I genuinely love and I've enjoyed collecting over time. And the only caveat I would have is that if you get to know a lot about one thinker, then suddenly these seem a little bit limiting. Like, they're really good if you're a beginner, but they're not completely self-sufficient. Now here I have one on Descartes, very short introduction, and Hegel. And these include images like photographs and artistic representations. You could read these in the bathtub. Like, I really like these. These are the Oxford Very Short Introductions. They look great on a shelf, very collectible. And you can find them for pretty much every philosopher and philosophical sort of area. Now, if you're looking for something a little bit more hefty, like a primary source, but you don't know where to start, I would actually recommend the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism. Now, the reason that I would recommend this one, it's a hefty tome. I would recommend you buy it secondhand because it's quite expensive. The reason I recommend this one is because it is a single volume and it helps you understand the relationship between philosophy, ancient philosophy, medieval philosophy, and if you will, emerging French philosophy, in relation, and German philosophy, of course, German idealism, in relationship to theory, including deconstructionism, literary theory, post-structuralism, deconstructionism, etc. And that's all in one volume. Now, what this volume does is that it gives you excerpts from primary sources. Like here we have a bit of Roland Barthes, which would be theory, a bit of Lukács, which would be Marxism, an excerpt from Hegel. But if we go back further, you'll also find excerpts from Plato, Phaedrus, for example. It also includes introductions to those texts, so a little bit of annotated secondary material. And perhaps my favorite part of this book is that at the very end of it, it has an index for different philosophical movements so that you can start understanding the terminology. You can see this is like a heavily annotated version. I've really enjoyed studying this. And it gives you, I don't know if I can find the right page, it basically gives you a list of all the, yeah, here we go. No, it's at the end. It gives you a list of all the different schools of thought and which texts and writers, which thinkers would be considered part of that school. Super helpful. I reread this actually in 2020 during lockdown, and it helped me make so many connections in my own reading. That is the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism. Now, if you're interested in a more analytic approach to philosophy, you can also find the Norton Anthology of, I believe, Western Philosophy, which comes in 2 volumes, so it's even more expensive. I don't currently have a copy of it, but I've seen it in bookstores, which has a more stronger philosophical approach. And while we're at it, let's talk a little bit about the distinction between analytic philosophy and so-called continental theory or philosophy. Now, if you've dabbled a little bit in philosophy or you've engaged in philosophical discussion, you are probably aware of the fact that there tend to be 2 camps of thought. And some people can be very rigid about this, like all analytic thought is bad or all continental philosophy is just abstract verbiage. And of course, we can find examples of analytic philosophy that relies perhaps a little bit too much on quote-unquote common sense and the defense of normative values and systems, hierarchies, if you will. But we can also identify certain continental theorists who really love to sprinkle a little bit of theory onto any one of their little projects. That's not the point, however. Strictly speaking, analytic philosophy and continental philosophy have so much in common. In fact, I think it's a little bit of an arbitrary distinction. It's helpful to understand, but I would recommend that you read both analytic philosophy as well as continental philosophy. In fact, we can trace this division all the way back to the division between what you might call idealism, specifically Platonic idealism, and Aristotelian positivism. And to give you a very quick introduction, idealism is interested in what you might call abstract problems, namely either the idea of concepts, which is to say, how does something exist in our heads? For example, I have a book, which is both the physical object, but also the concept of a book. In other words, there is an ideal abstracted notion of the book. Here we have one of the basic tenets of the problem with which idealism preoccupies itself, namely how the real world is filled in by ideal entities or abstract notions and concepts, which for Plato is always the reflection of a divine essence or notion, versus the things that you can study and observe empirically or rationally in the world, which falls under the banner of positivism. In fact, here we can see the 2 camps of analytic philosophy and idealist or continental philosophy in their original form, namely the Platonic approach by which the task of philosophy is to determine the ideal or essences which may or may not be possible, versus the Aristotelian approach, which is interested in the notion of what can be observed and measured and known in the world. To give you two pieces of jargon, we have here also the difference between ontology, namely the nature of what something is, which is an essentially idealist preoccupation, namely what is its essence, versus teleology, namely what is something's purpose, what is it for. And the positivist idea, in a nutshell, is that if you can determine something's ideal purpose, then you have understood the nature of what it is. Whereas the inversion of this, for Platonic idealism, is that if you can understand the nature of what something is in essence, you can determine its purpose. And so you can see how it's a similar problem, namely, what is reality and how is it constituted? But they approach it totally differently. Once again, the idealist idea is that if we can know an object's essence, we can understand its purpose, whereas the positivist approach, which eventually becomes the analytic one, is to say if we know something's purpose, we can understand its essence. Now, if you make an enormous leap forward towards a more contemporary analytic thought, you can see how from a continental or post-idealist perspective, the idea that something would have a ideal notion or use, or we've identified what something is for, is a normative idea, which could be a bit upsetting for people who tend to deconstruct the supposedly normative value of entities in the world. Hence, there tends to be a slight, if you will, political divide almost between a more conservative stance within idealism versus a more revolutionary stance within, if you will, a more this is where I'm going to confuse everybody. Say again, there's a more conservative stance within analytic philosophy, because it tends to focus a little bit more on certainties and what can be observed, and the idea of logic, if you will, the preservation of what is and what is not, versus the more revolutionary approach of the post-idealist philosophies, which are Platonic in nature, that actually undermine such certainties. In fact, the entire notion of Platonic philosophy is quite rebellious in nature, which is to say, the Socratic method is about undermining supposed certainties. In fact, this is why I really like Slavoj Žižek's definition of philosophy, in which he says, as soon as you refuse to accept what exists as given, you are practicing philosophy. Against this, the positivist school, which would later become the empiricist and rationalist and analytic school, doesn't focus so much on undermining certainty as much as it focuses on trying to establish reasonable foundations upon which such certainties could be predicated. And here you can see once again how certain analytic thinkers would be a little bit more conservative-minded, with an emphasis on such logical foundations of reason, whereas the idealist and post-idealist Platonic schools, if you will, are a little bit more, let's say, punk rock. They enjoy taking things apart. Now, this is, of course, a massive simplification, and I would encourage you to read in both directions, and you will find that the most interesting texts actually transcend the boundaries of either camp. Now, I'd like to briefly talk a little bit more about my own experience getting into philosophy before I give you some more recommendations about where to start and how you can see the tradition or lineage of philosophy in general. So, some of you may already know this, but I went to high school in the Netherlands, specifically in Utrecht, at the Christelijk Gymnasium Utrecht, which is a gymnasium. And what that means is that part of the education that I received there was that I had to learn Latin and Greek. Now, not spoken Latin, and certainly not spoken Greek, but I had to learn how to translate texts from the original Latin and Greek. And the way it worked was that we had 6 years of education, and you took Latin for 6 years, and Greek was an elective. So everybody had to take Greek in their second year, I believe, but then you could drop it in your fourth year if you wanted to. Now, I will immediately confess, to my detriment, that I dropped Greek after a couple of years because I way preferred Latin. I did learn the Greek alphabet, and I spent countless hours practicing vocab and translating, etc. But some of the beauty and the richness of the Greek texts and poetry was lost on me, which again, I now regret. In hindsight, I can see why Greek might have been even more enriching. Instead, I wanted to go much deeper into Latin, and so I did 6 years of Latin. And some of my best memories from high school are going to the library, the public library, and getting one of their little study cells and sitting there and for hours at a time translating Latin texts, imagining that I was like in some Warhammer universe as a scholar or scribe just working away. It really spoke to me. But it also means that by means of studying Latin, I was exposed to a lot of thought from the ancient world, from antiquity. And this meant that I already had a natural, if you will, in a natural way of getting into philosophy. But what's interesting is that at my school, even though we had Latin and Greek, and there's quite a bit of philosophy that came into those classes, we didn't actually have a designated philosophy class. And one of my teachers thought, this isn't right. And he started a philosophy club. Now, I should be very clear here that I'm talking about Western philosophy. In fact, this entire video focuses on the Western philosophical tradition, which of course is not the only one. But certainly from the perspective of my schooling, this is what I received. And this club was a group of people where we met after school, and he would try to explain to us, we literally were like in the basement, some philosophical concepts. And he worked through some of like Democritus and Heraclitus and the pre-Socratics and kind of gave us like the foundational background knowledge that you needed perhaps even before you started getting into Plato or Aristotle. And what I really remember about those classes is that he made it really fun because one of the central things that I learned at that club, our philosophy club, was that philosophy wasn't about the greatest minds or the greatest thinkers to have ever lived. In fact, it's a slightly reductionist take, I think, on philosophy to reduce it to all the best that has been thought within civilization, etc. In fact, it's one of the ironies of contemporary philosophy that perhaps the most popular introduction to philosophy, namely Bertrand Russell's introduction to Western philosophy, is perhaps, hot take, also one of the worst, or at least one of the least useful, precisely because it approaches philosophy as this, civilizational exercise in which we can take the good ideas and get rid of the bad ones and kind of work our way up towards this, what the greatest minds have thought. Against this way of teaching philosophy, the professor that I had at the time, and mind you, this is high school, his whole approach was to say philosophy is about analyzing problems. And once you understand that there are a certain set of problems within philosophy, you can start applying concepts to those problems, and thereby you become part of a tradition. And what was amazing about that, and I really remember it, is that he was basically saying that by means of being in this club, you are already a philosopher. You are already partaking in the grand tradition, which is philosophy. And that indeed, I think, is the most important thing about the Socratic method, is that Socrates invites everybody to think like a philosopher. He challenges everybody to think with precision and to have a mind that is alive to the contradictions of reality. There's something very, again, punk rock about Socrates and the way in which Plato writes the Socratic dialogues. There's something rebellious and indeed a little bit dangerous about them. And so one of the reasons why I would encourage anyone to read philosophy is because it can encourage this type of mindset, to question the world around you, to sort of pick apart at the way in which we construct reality and we normatively participate in it, which to say we follow certain given social mores and rules, And by means of reading philosophy or engaging in philosophical debate or being part of a philosophical community, we partake in that tradition. And so once you understand the problems of philosophy, like what is the nature of reality or what is the purpose of objects, then you can start applying concepts, which are essentially models that we apply to those problems. And then it's almost like you're playing Magic the Gathering or Pokemon, and you've got like your deck, and you can apply all these different combos to the problems using your deck and bringing together different ideas. And that's what makes philosophy alive. Like, as soon as you take a book of philosophy into your hands, you are partaking in philosophy. It's the coolest thing in the world. Like, it's close to magic, I think. In fact, I'll give you another example. I was watching, this time from the world of skateboarding. I was watching a video of Andy Anderson, who's this amazing skateboarder, a Canadian skateboarder, extremely gifted, extremely creative, especially in his freestyle skateboarding. And he was on a podcast with Rodney Mullen. And Rodney Mullen is like the wizard of skateboarding for my generation. Like, we all used to swap Rodney Mullen VHS cassettes at the local skate store to try to imitate his tricks. And Rodney Mullen brought a certain, you can look this up on YouTube, he brought a certain poetry to skateboarding, which said he totally blew open the rules. Like, there's something so not self-conscious about Rodney Mullen's style of skateboarding, where it just becomes this beautiful, free, abundant thing with no peer pressure at all. And Andy Anderson is like the contemporary, like this generation's version, I think, of Rodney Mullen. And there's a moment on the podcast where Andy says, all I wanted to do was I wanted to make a contribution and I wanted to create new opportunities for other skaters. And then Rodney Mullen looks at him, and it's a really emotional moment because, like, Andy's being complimented by his hero, and Rodney says, I think it's so amazing to be in your company because that's exactly what skating is about. And I was looking at that, I was like, for me, like, skating and philosophy has always been similar. As in philosophy, you're also trying to do new things, approach problems in different ways to make a contribution, but also to blow open doors for other people. And I really resent the idea that philosophy becomes this niche gatekeeping exercise that's exclusively linked to academia, because that's so not what philosophy is. Like, to me, philosophy should be, you take a philosophical text like, Plato or whatever, you pop it into your backpack and you go out and you go climbing or skating or hang out with your friends. And it's just this thing that is alive that you take with you into the world. And here I need to add one more hot take. I find it really too bad that increasingly what philosophy has become online is this, I'm going to search for a master who is going to give me wisdom on how to live. In fact, as much as I love Stoicism and the Stoics, there's a certain pipeline, I think, from Stoicism into a certain type of manosphere, aesthetic or grift or whatever you will, that to my mind feels so antithetical to what philosophy is. Philosophy shouldn't be, I'm giving you this list of rules for how to live your life in complete isolation so that you can be the strongest, most stoic version of yourself, like, don't cry at your father's funeral, stuff like this. I think that's such nonsense. I think it's a symptom of increasingly alienated life that we think that philosophy is this. And that has nothing really to do with Stoicism either. Like, in its historical context, Stoicism emerges as a democratizing effort to have more people engaged in philosophy in a way that applies to their real lives. And so, like, to my mind, getting philosophy back to something that feels plugged into our lives and our reality, but doesn't become this normative reduction of rules that you're supposed to live by. That would be my goal and my dream. Okay, so briefly to go back to my high school experience, I was in this club. I really enjoyed it. Some of it was a little silly, like classic, teacher points at a chair and says, can you prove to me that this is really a chair, etc. But then I get to college. And I'm not studying philosophy. I still have an interest in philosophy, but I'm not studying philosophy. At the time, I'm doing an exchange program at the University of Freiburg in Germany, um, where I'm like in an anthropology department. I'm doing some cultural anthropology. We're doing Michel de Montaigne. I'm starting to realize that like I have all these gaps in my knowledge because I haven't actually read the primary sources. And so one day I decide, all right, I'm going to get into philosophy. I'm going to go to my local bookstore and I'm going to buy the nicest, most expensive copy of Plato's Republic. And I did not have any money at the time. So this was like a big deal for me. This was like, I was literally going to eat like, not that I was poor, but like I was going to eat yogurt and canned food for a week to buy this book because I had a very tight budget. And I bought the book and I went home, I brewed a cup of coffee, I opened it up, and I realized that it was not very fun. I did not get it. I was reading Plato for the first time in English translation, annotated, and I was like, what is this? Where am I supposed to start with this or engage with this? Like, I could read it, but it didn't make sense to me in relationship to what I thought a book was. Was it telling me what to think? Was it giving me instructions? Was it entertaining me? Like, how do I even approach this text? And it made me feel very lost. And this was after I'd already been part of the philosophy club and like I was already, in my early 20s, somebody who I thought should be able to do this. And it only got worse from there because then I went to the library and I picked up some content, some Hegel, and I realized I have no idea how to read this. Like these primary texts are hard. Hegel and Kant are still hard for me to read. But this is where I felt so lucky that I'd gotten to enjoy studying Latin in school. Because I started to realize that my experience of reading books was always about leisure. I'm reading this book passively, I'm consuming it. But what a philosophical text wants from you is it wants engagement. It wants you to approach it like a puzzle. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to treat this as if I were translating it. Even though it's in English, I have to translate it back into my own language. And so I would do the same thing I did with Latin. I would sit down with pen and paper, and line by line, I would translate what the text said. And I would literally treat the words that I didn't know as if they were like in a foreign language. I would go and look up what that word meant. Of course, this is a painstaking process. You can only do it in little increments. You have to enjoy it. Like, in the same way that I enjoyed painting little miniatures, I would enjoy doing half an hour of reading Plato. Now that I have that arsenal of concepts already, those translations, if you will, it's easy for me to go back to a text. Like, I get it. It still takes a lot of focus. Like, I find Kant really difficult to read, but I can at least work my way through it. But here's the thing. Once you do that for a little bit, it actually becomes kind of addictive. Suddenly, I promise you this, suddenly, books that are just there to entertain you, like bestsellers, etc., they're not going to be as fun to read. Once you get the bug for that kind of close reading, which I like to think of as translating, where like every sentence carries such an important load of meaning and consequence for the idea that is being developed with your help, suddenly other forms of reading seem a little bit like, what am I doing here? And so the pleasure of the text, and this may not be true for everybody, but it comes over time, is that you feel locked into the text as if it were a puzzle. And this is where I want to go back to the idea of tradition. Philosophy is a tradition. It's about working on different problems in new ways. Like Kant blew open the conceptual edifice of philosophy with his Critique of Pure Reason. I've said this before, but like the Critique of Pure Reason is really just saying, wait a minute, how can anything be considered pure, essence, if it is already premediated by conceptual reason? I.e., if you think or write the word essence, how can it still be ideal? Isn't it already contaminated by reason? In other words, maybe the entire project of idealist philosophy is totally pointless and impossible. That's basically Kant's argument in the Critique of Pure Reason. And if you work through it carefully, it's like, oh wow, this is actually really impactful. He's being a total rebel here. And what's interesting is that then you see German idealism and philosophy exploding because the gauntlet is being thrown down by Kant in a way that changes everything. And suddenly young people start picking up on philosophy. Like you see Schelling and Fichte, and eventually, of course, Hegel also picking up the shards, the shattered pieces of philosophy that Kant has left behind. Like Kant wrecked the central edifice of idealist philosophy. And the irony is that Kant believed himself to be an empiricist, like a rationalist. He basically took a quote-unquote analytic approach to idealism and said, well, what now? That's like, if you read the opening to the Critique of Pure Reason, like that's his approach. Let's properly think this through, even if it means we risk ruining everything we've done. And when Fichte, who then goes to visit Kant, is like, I'm so excited by this, you can see that like there's a certain enthusiasm shared by both of them. Like, here's something new that can be done. Philosophy shouldn't be about, oh, let's look at the old stuff, the best that's been thought. It should be about continuously blowing open possibilities. That's why it's exciting. It's alive. Like, to me, philosophy is the most punk rock way of approaching thought and learning. In fact, I don't think you have to go to school for philosophy. I don't think you have to go to university to enjoy it. In fact, many philosophy departments will be much more rigid than what you'll find if you go into other fields and study philosophy on the side or as an elective course. And so philosophy doesn't have to be restrictive or gatekeeping. To my mind, it's important to see it as something that feels really alive, something that feels really powerful, that creates opportunities, that disrupts our certainties, and that makes us uncomfortable in a really comfortable way. Okay, so I want to briefly end here with some actual recommendations for where you might want to start if you're getting into philosophy. The good news is that it is easier than ever before to literally just Google a philosophy text, pull up a PDF, and start reading. And like I said before, I would encourage slow reading. Let yourself be bewildered, let yourself be confused, write down what you think every sentence means, work through like a page at a time. Speed reading philosophy is the dumbest thing ever. That makes no sense. Work through it slowly. It's very, very good that way. Now, where would I begin reading philosophy? Because that is the million-dollar question. I still think that beginning with Plato is a good idea, because I think the Socratic dialogue gives you a structure that resembles almost like a plot that you can